All right, I'm really happy that we've got a nice little group here forming for the first of what I think will be probably 5, maybe 6 reading sessions, maybe sooner. I don't really know. But we're going to be embarking on something starting this evening that I believe is really important. As I pointed out in the invitation, I got something in the waiting room here. As I pointed out in the invitation, it has come into a more clear idea in my mind that a governing the one of the principled governing impulses shaping the last 2,000 years of world history has been the obsessive agenda to create a new type of religious order that was that's really a lot more in that has a lot more in common to the old synthetic cults that shaped so much of the ancient world pre-Christian, and even during the time of Christianity and afterwards. There were pseudo-Christian synthetic cults. Often there are many flavors, many variations on the theme, masquerading on the surface as being Christian, but ultimately acting as covers for occult, very dark mystery religions that really just put on a new garb, a new costume. So this paper that we're going to read today, it's a longer essay. It was published in a 1980 edition of the Campaigner Review. The author is somebody who I didn't really know about. I'm not too sure what else he's done over the years. This was written over 40 years ago. I found it very useful in the sense that the author did have a good grounding in the science of physical economy. He was at the time a volunteer researcher with an associate of Lyndon LaRouche. He took, hold on, keep on letting people keep on getting to the waiting room. This author, Richard Dreyfuss, not the actor, was able to take a sort of appreciation that he had gained of the science of physical economy and the clash of the two different opposing paradigms represented by two different views of human nature, which are it's not just a current tension in our times or in recent history, that these two opposing views, the view that human beings are made in the image of a living, loving, reasonable creator in juxtaposition to another viewpoint that rejects this notion and instead posits that human beings are some form of animal machine to be ruled over by an alpha class, a higher caste of masters over slaves who are destined to be obedient serfs under some feudal, construct. These are two very incompatible ideas, right? But it's not a new thing. It goes back to the ancient times. And so this author had a pretty good sense of that epistemological battle. He had a pretty good sense of geopolitics. And so because I think that the drive currently is not just to reduce the world population or to make people dumb or to keep them divided to fight each other. These are all things that are desired by empire. Those are true things that all empires will always desire. But more than that is to get us to do it ourselves and to want to think that that is all we can do and must do. And to achieve that requires myths, folklore, stories that become governing, almost sacred stories that answer deep questions that we all fundamentally have about the nature of that which is beyond our lives, right? The creator, God, our soul, all of these fundamental, big transcendental questions can be answered by sacred stories. But who controls the stories? And are they in alignment with the discoverable laws of nature and God's creation, or are they completely synthetic creations designed to control us? So the Eleusinian mysteries is something which I'm noticing is being amplified. It's never ended. I don't think that there's ever been a time in the last 2,000 years where these occult mysteries ever stopped, except for much of that time they were reserved for the inner elites. I think that the world is currently being pushed into a sort of mass initiation process that involves a hybrid synthesis of drugs, modern different types of drugs that are increasingly tied to new ideologies that associate a drug experience, psychedelic experience with a spiritual experience. And of course, especially since the Cold War, tying this all together with extraterrestrial beings, either from our dimension or from other dimensions or some mix of both. Carl Jung had a thing to say about this as well, who worked very closely with Alan Dulles in the use of the UFO concept to shape society, or have society want to shape itself. All of these things are part of the great narrative. This idea that we need new stories to replace the outdated Judeo-Christian stories of the past 2,000 years, the age of Pisces, whereas now we're entering the age of Aquarius, of course, right? And that requires a new set of stories, because people are going to be somehow different in this transhumanist age. So I say all of this as a bit of a rant, but I really just wanted to set the tempo a little bit for why we're reading this paper that was written 40 years ago about things that happened 2,000 plus years ago. And like usual, we're going to take turns reading. If we've got somebody who's really in the zone, who loves the reading and the flow is going well, you can keep reading for a longer period. If people want to just take turns, that's fine too. If people want to stop, ask a question, share a thought, that's okay too. And then, when we close it up, it'll be about an hour and a half of reading. We'll close it up, have a little chat about what we read today. We'll pick somebody to do a bit of a recap next week. That'll be so think about if you want to volunteer to be that person who does a bit of a recap. It could be multiple people next week in case we have new people coming in. It's also good for the mind and mental muscles. So let's get the ball rolling. Let's do a share screen. Can people see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now, who would like to be today's reader?
I guess I'll go.
All right, Dave, go for it.
I actually have the Fidelio in front of me, but I guess just to make sure there's no differences, I'll stare at the screen.
No, this is different. Yeah, this is not the one that's published in the Fidelio. This is a longer, unredacted version, more raw.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay. How Jesus and his followers saved civilization. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was made nothing that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shone in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man, one sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness to the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness to that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man who cometh into the world. He was made in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them he gave the power to become sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. And the Logos was made flesh and dwelt among us.
All right.
Well, do I keep going or?
I think that you keep going, sure.
Oh, okay. Unless Bruce wants to read. That's the only. I'll keep reading unless if Bruce gets an.
You start reading and then Bruce. That's a great idea. But let's do like 30 minutes of reading and then
yeah, for sure. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against princedoms and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. St. Paul, Epistle to the Ephesians, 6:12.
Dave, do me a favor, hit record on your side. I suspect that my internet might crap out. So just to have a backup. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. The epic battle lasting I have a bar next to the text here, the epic battle lasting 3 centuries that resulted in the defeat of the Roman Empire by the fledgling Judeo-Christian movement was a struggle for the survival of the human race itself. The establishment of the Christian tradition, victorious at the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, was the result of a well-organized and self-conscious conspiracy. The architects of the Christian movement, led at the start by Philo Judaeus of Alexandria and Jesus of Nazareth, viewed themselves as the founders of a new world order. Amid the collapse and degradation of Roman immorality, the power of the Christian idea slowly won a widespread following among philosophers, the nobility, merchants and traders, skilled craftsmen, and the elite of the Mediterranean world. Christianity emerged at a time when the entire known world was perched at the brink of utter barbarism. The masses of the empire were caught up in the spell of ancient Eastern cults and mystery religions, whose evil priests and priestesses exercised virtual control over the day-to-day life of the emperor and the peasant alike. The alliance between the emperor, the cults, and the Roman army had created a cannibalistic monster whose insatiable demand for loot by conquest and taxation had plunged the world into a cycle of plague and famine. The spirit of rational, scientific inquiry had vanished, and with it the impetus for developing new technology. Plato's academy at Athens had become an empty shell of its former self. Were it not for the establishment of the Christian movement, the complete disintegration of the social fabric and loss of the precious, irreplaceable heritage of philosophy and science painstakingly accumulated over the previous 1,000 years would have been inevitable. For all practical purposes, the human race would have ceased to exist, and what scattered fragments of humanity did manage to survive would have had to begin all over again the Promethean task of rediscovering epistemology. Acting openly when possible, in alliance with princes, Roman senators, and sometimes even the emperor himself, at other times acting with clandestine stealth and communicating by secret rite, parable, and allegory, the Christian conspirators transformed the heritage of Platonic philosophy and science into the founding principles of a universal humanist empire. The explicit goal of the early Christian party was the establishment of what Philo Judaeus, Jesus of Nazareth, St. Paul, and St. John called the kingdom of God. That concept, also described as the kingdom of heaven, is not, as is usually suggested, an otherworldly one. The Christian movement was very emphatically political, and its enemies were very much in this world indeed. The enemy of the Christians was the unholy alliance uniting the reactionary Roman nobility and the Persian oligarchy, the Aristotelians in the peripatetic school of pseudo-philosophy, the degenerate Stoic and Epicurean cults, and especially the evil priesthood of the Oriental cults, controlling the hundreds of local associations dedicated to rites of animal worship, castration, and death. Against this satanic coalition, personified today in direct line of succession by the Black Guelph monarchists and the heirs of liberal British empiricism, the Christians sought to establish the primacy of Platonic epistemology in order to transubstantiate the groveling mass of sheep-like peasants into republican citizens of the kingdom of God. In bringing reason to the masses, the church confirmed itself to be a direct threat to the Isis priesthood and the empire. The Roman oligarchs did not deceive themselves into thinking that Christianity would lull their subjects with promises of a paradise in Never Never Land, for such was not the case. The political blueprint of Philo Judaeus, the sermons of Jesus, the revolutionary writings of St. Paul, and the explosive response that the gospel elicited among the inhabitants of the Roman Empire made it evident that the kingdom of God was indeed at hand. The grand design of Christianity to perfect the state by bringing it and its citizens into harmony with the Platonic ideal of reason and natural law was based on a system of philosophical concepts that, in sum, represented a secret knowledge. It was this secret knowledge, compiled most efficiently in the Timaeus of Plato, which the cults and mystery religions tried most strenuously to liquidate when it first emerged in the Judeo-Christian Revolution. Such secrets, thought the priests of Isis and the Stoics, had been dead for hundreds of years, only to reappear suddenly and with incredible fury in the writings of Philo and in the New Testament. Embodied in the so-called Christian mysteries, the incarnation of Christ, the Trinity, the redemption, was, for those that hear, the content of his secret knowledge. I will open my mouth in parables, said Christ, as recorded by the gospel according to St. Matthew. I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. Of course, the form used by the apostolic church fathers and their successors to convey this knowledge was myth. The elite of the early Christian church was undoubtedly aware that the superficial details of the story of Jesus of Nazareth and the literal meaning of key church doctrines were merely part of a technology for communicating deeper truths. Perhaps the founders of the Christian movement had no recourse but to propound their ideas in allegorical format. The material-cultural level of existing Roman social organization was abysmally low, and the population of the Mediterranean world hardly fit to receive undiluted science into their daily lives. Furthermore, the conditions prevailing at the time of the Roman Empire were, to say the least, not conducive to overt political philosophical organization. And the principles of human psychology had not yet been sufficiently elaborated to permit a more direct pedagogical approach aimed at leading dulled and backward human minds through a complex process of self-understanding. But the immortal achievement of the early church was that, for the first time, masses of citizens were able to grasp the Platonic method as promulgated by a permanent and lasting institution, and to guide their daily lives by its ethical and spiritual principles. The content of the Christian religion and its mysteries were most centrally located in the doctrine of the Logos.
The word. That's what PT said.
For Philo, the Logos was the principle of creative reason, that is, the principle by which the creator God brought order to chaos and thereby generated the seed principles of the creation and development of the universe. Philo knew that the vast majority of the citizens of Rome were victims of a barbarian cult ideology. Addressing himself, therefore, first of all, to the urban Hellenized Jewish community, which was capable of responding to his message, Philo asserted that the universe is governed by an inherent creative principle, or logos. Philo called logos the idea of ideas, that is, the concept that allows the mind to generate other lower order concepts, or Plato's hypothesis of the higher hypothesis.
All right, we've got a quick little thought or question from Alan and or Janet. I see a digital hand. You're on mute, Janet. You have to take yourself off of mute.
Sorry, we didn't put our hand up. I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay. All's good.
No question. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
It's just saying hi.
Right. Hi.
Gradually, Philo created a faction of enlightened Jews who seized upon the Logos principle. In Philo's epistemological system, the Logos was an intermediary which served as a bridge between God the Creator, on the one hand, and the differentiated ideas existing within the realm of creation, on the other. In fact, in several treatises, Philo called the Logos the Son of God. It represented the instrument through which the Creator God perpetually elaborated or perfected his creation. It was reason. The bold genius of Christianity was the representation of Jesus of Nazareth as the Logos incarnate, personifying what in Philo's writing had been a rather abstract philosophical construct, and thus making it immediately accessible to a large population of quite uneducated people. Consciously making use of the fact that Philo's work had won acclaim among the inner elite of Jewish intellectuals, Jesus represented himself as the Logos, the Son of God. Always subordinated to the Father, Jesus nevertheless called himself the instrument through which God brought about creation. Or as St. John writes, the Logos was in the beginning with God, and all things were made by him, and without him was made nothing that was made. By urging that men and women follow Jesus and so become sons of God, the early Christians communicated to the Jew and pagan alike that each contained within himself the power to bring forth their own divinity and live a life governed by reason. Thus, for the Christians, Jesus embodied a concrete universal, self-conscious, self-expanding reason. On a simpler level, the utter uncompromising morality of Jesus of Nazareth, even more striking amid the moral squalor of ancient Rome, caused Jesus to become a model for ethical behavior. Quite literally, he was the living conscience of an entire empire. The fact that Jesus of Nazareth established the movement that came to be called Christianity points up a significant idea concerning the relationship between Jesus and Philo. Whereas Philo was content to present his enormously powerful ideas objectively in the form of essays and coded writing, Jesus was compelled to organize a mass movement on the basis of those ideas. Nothing underlines this idea more than the fact that it was Jesus, and not Philo, who was crucified by the authorities. Although Philo fought courageously against the cult enemy that ruled Rome, toward the end of his life, even in direct cooperation with the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, nevertheless, a particular quality of human love and vibrancy is missing from his work. The same quality that is so warmly and powerfully present in the work of the first Christians. On the question of law, for instance, the Jews of Judea and the urban centers of the Mediterranean diaspora for centuries had lived under the painfully strict and rather cumbersome rules and regulations of ancient Jewish tradition, compounded by the complex system of unofficial legalisms forever argued over by the Pharisees and Sadducees of the temple. Philo, in a masterstroke, abolished the old system by putting forth a new system of the law of Moses, in which Philo's Moses was diabolically identified with Plato and the humanist scientists of the Alexander the Great era. Philo's new Mosaic law managed to replace the 10 Commandments, symbolizing the thou shalt not mentality, with a prescriptive positive law. By introducing the Logos in this context, Philo laid the basis for the modern concept of a republican constitution embodying the coherence of natural law, as defined by the Neoplatonists and constitutional law. Jesus of Nazareth, by forcing the issue, used such means as, for instance, breaking up the immoral activities in the Jerusalem temple, then completed what Philo only began explicitly rather than merely implicitly, replacing the 10 Commandments and the law of Moses with the new dispensation, the law of love. The idea of the kingdom of heaven, in which the social political order is determined according to reason, provided in subsequent centuries the model for the city of God of St. Augustine, written in the early 5th century, and for the Ummah, community, established in the 7th century by the Prophet Muhammad's constitution of Medina. The humanist Carolingian and Abbasid empires emerged, respectively, in Europe and the Middle East on the foundation of these principles. Christian and Muslim humanists of succeeding centuries derive their inspiration from the common heritage of Near Eastern Neoplatonism, especially as represented in the traditions of the Judaism of Rabbi Philo, Apostolic Christianity, and Islam. The overarching Islamic Ismaili tradition that took root at the caliphal court in Baghdad and later spread into Egypt, North Africa, and Southern Europe carried the principle of the logos further. It is in this sense that the early Christians laid the basis for Neoplatonic humanism and political republicanism in every succeeding generation. The Neoplatonic content of the Judeo-Christian movement was thus a deliberate attempt to interpret the relationship between the universe and the mind of an individual man or woman in such a way that the essential special role and responsibility of that mind or soul in contributing to universal progress or perfection is most easily assimilated. According to Plato, Philo, and the Christians, the logos was the principle by which a rational and coherent order was established in the universe. The role of man in that universe, in the doing of God's work, by perfecting creation, is identified with virtue. Virtue, for Philo and the Christians, was assisting man to achieve mastery of creation through the development of a spirit of scientific inquiry. Achieving such mastery over the universe is a deliberate act, and in this context, sin is defined as willful deviation from that commandment. Thus, the precious and unique contribution of an individual soul to God's universal design, which can only be mediated by concrete actions in the real world, becomes an ideal that generates enormous moral pressure to live according to a set of ethical principles of humanism, i.e., conscience. Through this method, the beast-like, amoral denizens of the Mediterranean world were transformed into human beings. The life of Jesus of Nazareth, as transmitted by the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is therefore the direct representation in symbolic form of the very essence of Neoplatonic humanism. As Jesus prayed to his Father, speaking of the population of sheep-like men and women, I in them, and thou in me, that they may be made perfect in one. Just as Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, was consubstantial with God, being both human and divine, so man could strive and succeed to become divine. Mankind itself, thus consubstantial with the God of reason. By his death on the cross, Jesus subordinated his ephemeral existence to the higher principle, the will of the Father. For the millions of citizens of the empire who would soon shake off the cultist evil for adherence to the Christian faith, the idea of Jesus was a cathartic occurrence. The accumulated sins and transgressions of 100 generations, so evident in the pervasive evil of the Roman world, could be thought of as having combined to cause the death of the innocent, godlike Jesus of Nazareth. In the Christian view, the death of Jesus effectively atoned for those evils. The early Christian organizers brought home the message to the population at large that Jesus of Nazareth had died for their sins, and they were now free, if they chose, to start a new life unencumbered by the baggage of what had come before. The story of Jesus Christ is undoubtedly the best known and loved story in all human history. It has inspired works of art and architecture that have each sought to capture the essence of the Christ story and to universalize it for mankind. The poetry of Dante, the works of Rembrandt, and Leonardo da Vinci, Handel's Messiah, the Gothic cathedrals were all the product of a deeply religious humanism created by individual geniuses who understood the secrets of the Christian idea. In the following, we present the true story of Jesus of Nazareth and his apostles for the first time. It is a story so packed with powerful emotion that it should make the modern reader cry out. In fact, the real history of the Christian Revolution is far, far more wonderful than the story that most Christians know from a simple reading of the New Testament. The men and women, philosophers and politicians who built the church, who taught its students, who battled the cults and suffered and died in the Roman Colosseum, wrote history with their blood. Without them, there is little question that we would not be here today. In that spirit, we write the true history of the Christian church. The enemy of the Neoplatonic movement, founded by Philo, Jesus, St. Peter, St. Paul, and St. John, was truly an unspeakable evil. The blood-curdling monstrosity of the power that ruled Rome in the first century has never been equaled in the 2,000 years that have since passed. While virtually every organized force for evil throughout the past 2 millennia derives its origin and model directly from the cults of Rome, there has been no case during these long centuries when power resided so absolutely in the hands of Satan as it did under the Roman Empire. The enemy of the Christians was indeed an ancient one. For lack of a better name, it should be called the cult. For an almost unbroken span lasting 300 years, from the accession of Emperor Julius Caesar after the fall of the Roman Republic, every single Roman emperor was a participant in the death cult rituals of the Roman mystery religions. To a greater or lesser extent, each of these emperors was a puppet of the cult priesthoods that were the real source of power in ancient Rome. Of course, the Roman Republic was itself thoroughly corrupted by the cult, and its leading oligarchical families became the sponsors of various cults and mystery religions. But it was during the period of the empire that the cult established itself in full flower in Rome and among the Roman nobility. From there, it permeated every aspect of daily life under the emperors. To this day, some leading families of the aristocracy in Italy trace their origin correctly back to the time of the emperors and the cults, and in alliance with the last remnants of the Black Wolf feudal nobility, endeavor to keep alive the tradition of the cult. Some emperors, like Vespasian and Titus of the house of Flavius, the chief aristocratic sponsor of the Egyptian cult of Isis, Osiris, Horus in Rome, were oligarchical patrons of the cult priesthoods in their own right. Others, like the psychotic Gaius Caligula or Nero, were merely insane pawns manipulated by the priests of the cult. The cult itself took many disguises, yet it was always the same. In a grand, hideous federation, a network of cults spanned the Roman Empire. What unified the cults was the slave-like worship of its degraded mass of adherents for a central goddess mother figure. In almost every case, the ritual of the cult involved some variant of self-castration or castration of a symbolic living bull. Every manner of inhumane sadomasochistic rite and sexual perversion was associated with the ceremony of the Roman cults. The goddess herself had innumerable names. In Egypt, she was called Isis. In Cyprus, she was Aphrodite. In Eleusis, Demeter. In Pessinus, Cybele. In Ephesus, Artemis or Diana. In Syria, Atargatis. In Crete, Rhea. In Sparta, Orthia. Inevitably, her mate, in the associated myth, was an impotent, henpecked god far less powerful than the goddess. The goddess herself always personified capricious, arbitrary judgment and injustice. No order or reason prevailed in the world of the cult goddess. Man was forced to submit to the whims of an insane goddess whose evil vengeance could only be forestalled by submission and propitiation by sacrifice. Words cannot describe the horror of the world of the Romans under the influence of the cult. It must be understood that unlike the present, when only a tiny fraction of the American population is involved in cults like the People's Temple of Reverend Jim Jones and slightly larger fraction ensnared by the so-called fundamentalist cults, and even a substantial minority captured by the drug and counterculture cult of the disco movement. At the time of the Roman Empire, the majority of the population either belonged as an active participant or as a passive adherent to the federation of cults. Rome was governed by a pervasive mass psychosis. Imagine Jim Jones as president of the United States and Reverend Some Young Moon's zombies having taken over St. Patrick's Cathedral and Temple Emmanuel in New York. And you have ancient Rome. In Rome, the so-called state cult of emperor worship sat atop the cult federation.
Sorry.
Beneath that formal institution ranged the entire gamut of Dionysian cults of animal worship, bestiality, and obscure Persian and Oriental mystery religions that had entered Rome and its empire by way of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. Bloody rites of animal sacrifice and even human sacrifice prevailed throughout the empire, and occult shrines and oracles dotted the cities of the Roman world. The state cult, which was administered by the Pontifex Maximus and the class of priests, was allied to the official pantheon of Rome, including Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, Saturn, Venus, Ceres, Apollo, Mercury, Diana, and Castor and Pollux. Then last came the specialized cults, Isis, Magna Mater, Mithra, and so forth. The system was highly organized. Throughout the empire, trade and commerce were placed generally in the hands of the priests and their allies who controlled the thousands of temples. Each temple would also serve as a bank, controlling the credit and trade mechanism for a specific area. Then the regional cults administered by the oligarchy and the priesthood would be handed the franchise to collect taxes by the Roman military and the provincial governor. The Roman system of tax farming came to represent for empires to come the very model of an efficient looting machine. With the exception of minor improvements in architectural science and improvements in fields of military technology, the centuries-long contribution of Rome to prosperity was virtually nil. In the provinces, only an efficient system of roads and bridges, necessary for purposes of military transport, can be singled out as representing even the slightest form of internal improvements. Otherwise, only lavish temples to the emperor and the pantheon of gods stood as the fruits of Roman labors. In science, the Roman period of history cannot be said to have contributed any significant breakthroughs in any field. In art, Rome contented itself with mere imitations of magnificent art of Greece, often with banal or pornographic overtones. The history of the emergence of Rome into prominence accounts for the type of rule that marked the period of the empire. From the beginning, the Greek influence in the Western Mediterranean, especially the cultural impact of the Platonic Academy, found itself concentrated in Sicily and southern Italy, at a time when Rome was merely a provincial village in the central Italian peninsula. With the collapse and fragmentation of Alexander the Great's empire after his assassination and the subsequent decline of Greek political power and influence, a tenuous axis emerged between Rome and the North African city of Carthage, an axis that, under other circumstances, might have produced a new power center committed to progress and development. For Carthage represented a tangential product of the great Phoenician scientific culture that was a remnant of the civilization of the Atlantis period. But the consolidation of power in Egypt by the dynasty of the Ptolemies, who established a separate state thereafter Alexander's death, allowed the cults of Egypt and the Orient to flourish and expand their worldwide influence. The individual naivete and large manpower resources of the area around Rome made that unfortunate city the early target of the Egyptian cult, which sought a means to infiltrate Rome and thus undermine from within the emergent Rome-Carthage axis. At least one hypothesis is that the Egyptian cult of Isis and its priesthood provoked the disastrous series of the so-called Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage as a ploy to divide those two powers and encourage the growth of Rome as a proto-imperial power in the Western Mediterranean as a counterbalance against Carthaginian influence. Hannibal, the great general of Carthage, sought to establish a form of geopolitical alliance against what was now becoming the Roman-Egyptian axis, and he proposed to form a pact with the Syrian general Antiochus III toward the end of the 3rd century BC in an effort to break the power of Egypt and its cult allies in Asia Minor. It was during this period that the Egyptian cults and the pseudo-scientific notions of the Aristotelians and Stoics gained hegemony in Rome, and the final defeat of Carthage and Hannibal's flight to Syria marked the permanent rise to power of Rome. But Rome, now, was a puppet state of the Egyptian ideological warriors of the cult of Isis. Also during this period, the cult's priests of Egypt began to sink their claws into the Jewish elite. Syria, under Antiochus III and Antiochus IV Epiphanes, battled constantly with Egypt, and often the bone of contention and battleground for this rivalry was Palestine. For this reason, the Egyptians sought an alliance with the Jews of Judea and the East, and they sought to encourage anti-Syrian uprisings by the Jews. The translation of the Jewish Bible from Hebrew into Greek, the famous Septuagint, occurred during this period of conflict as a Ptolemaic effort to win a following of Jew-turned-ISIS worshippers. Thus, gradually, the Roman aristocracy was taken over first by the Greek cults, and then increasingly, with the beginning of the 2nd century, by the ISIS cults of Egypt and the Orient. These cults made it more and more difficult for remaining pockets of scientific inquiry and reason to continue their frail existence. And by the time of Philo and the early Christians, the flickering lights had virtually all been stamped out. Not actually disappearing, they were driven underground or were forced to adopt a seemingly innocuous and eccentric pose in order to survive. From the beginning, the various cults arranged themselves into secret societies and brotherhoods, and it was through these societies that the inner workings of Roman politics were determined. To be powerful in Rome meant that one must become a member of one of the ruling brotherhoods, or perhaps several, which would be accompanied by an initiation into the rites and mysteries of one of the cults. Some of these atrocities, such as the well-known... Sorry?
Never mind. It's synonymous enough, I guess.
Sorry. Some of these societies, such as the well-known Arval Brotherhood, lasted many centuries. The Arval Brotherhood, which reportedly began at the founding of Rome itself, lasted hundreds of years into the empire period until one of the Christian emperors abolished it as a pagan throwback. Virtually every Roman empire from Augustus through the 3rd century AD was a member of the Arval Brotherhood. Such societies served later as the basis for the foundation of the various Freemasonries and the chivalric orders such as the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem at Malta and the British Order of the Garter. To oversee the entire federation of cults and mystery religions, there was the Roman Committee of 15, which exercised enormous power throughout the empire by virtue of its mandate to license and thus give official sanction to new cults and mystery religions as they would emerge in Rome. The Committee of 15 had charge of the Sibylline books, a collection of mysterious utterances and pseudo-prophetic gobbledygook associated with the cult of Apollo. Though ancient, under the reign of Augustus, the Sibylline books were reorganized and placed in the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine by the emperor himself. They remained there for over 500 years as the ultimate source of Roman cult worship until they were destroyed in the Christian era by the general Stilicho on orders from Emperor Theodosius the Great. The Committee of 15 would act as consultant to the Roman Senate, and it would inform the senators of the directives and forecasts of Sibylline oracles. Of course, whoever controlled the interpretation of the oracles' declarations wielded great power in Rome. Incidentally, it was the Committee of 15 that ruled, in the middle of the 1st century, that the new Christian religion was an illegal cult, which led to the murderous attempts to suppress it. It was through the Sibylline books and the Temple of Apollo at Delphi that the networks of the cult snaked their way into Rome. For instance, during the Second Punic War, about 205 BC, the Sibylline oracles produced a prophecy suggesting that if the Senate brought to Rome a priestly delegation of the cult of the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, Sibyl, then Rome would be victorious in its war. The Senate agreed, sending an embassy to Pergamum in Pessinus to bring the cult into the capital of the Republic. Thus, in 191 BC, a temple of the Great Mother was erected. Within a short time, however, the superstitious senators were horrified by reports that initiates into the cult throughout the city were ritually castrating themselves as part of the ceremonial entry into the rite. Frantically, the Senate sought to suppress the cult, with some success, before the population was literally emasculated. However, some supporting brotherhoods and secret societies were allowed to flourish, and their paramilitary branches became well entrenched. By about 1000 BC,
100.
By about 100 BC, the first Roman eunuch was consecrated as a priest of the Great Mother cult. Finally, about 50 AD, under Emperor Claudius, all restrictions were removed on the cult, and the evil Committee of 15 gave its stamp of approval to the cult by officially taking part in the procession of eunuchs, transvestites, homosexuals, and sadistic priestesses who headed the cult. Later, as we shall see, it was the cult of the Magna Mater, which was transformed almost entirely into the heretical pseudo-Christian cult of Gnosticism. In the 1st century before Christ, the entry of the cult into Rome gained momentum. The flagship cult of the period was the infamous cult of Isis Osiris Horus of Egypt. Although its origins in the Persian and Babylonian East are today shrouded in mystery, at the time of the Roman Empire, the cult of Isis was based in Philae, along the Nile River in Upper Egypt. From its headquarters there, the priests of the cult extended their tentacles far and wide. First, a branch of the chief temple was established in the port city of Alexandria, from which sailors and merchants would be recruited into the cult, and priests would be trained to establish still more branch temples. By the time of Julius Caesar, the Isis cult was active in Athens, Delphi, the Greek islands, throughout Asia Minor, and North Africa, in Sardinia, Spain, Pompeii, Rome, Switzerland, and Germany. So strong was the cult by 50 BC in Rome that when Aemilius Paulus sought to tear down a temple of Isis in the capital city, he was unable to find any workers who would defy the threats of assassination from the terrorist and paramilitary arm of the Isis priesthood. Later, Emperor Gaius Caligula oversaw the construction of the first officially sanctioned Isis temple, and the cult persisted for centuries afterward in Rome. Still another prominent cult was that of Mithra. The Mithra cult was an elite cult whose adherents, it appears, were drawn especially from the ranks of the Roman army and its officer corps, and from officials of the Roman treasury. From this and other evidence, it is clear that the cult of Mithra is almost the paradigm of the political intelligence cult, fashioned by the priests to gain power and influence within the oligarchy and the government. In particular, Mithra's influence in the army was explicitly subversive to the Roman state. And by the 1st century AD, it was the army and especially the Praetorian Guard that wielded all the effective power in Rome. Mithra was a sun god, commonly represented in the Greek and Roman world as the god Apollo, but also maintaining an identity of his own for select circles. The Mithra cult's origins were in India and it entered Rome from Persia and the East generally, bringing with it the dualistic worldview of the Zoroastrian cult of darkness and light, whose god, Ahura, was the commander of Mithra. The god Mithra achieved supremacy in the heavens by his ritual defeat and slaughter of the bull figure, who was the creation of Mithra's rival, Ahura. Bound up in each cult, whether Isis, Magna Mater, Mithra, and so forth, were unspeakably brutal rites and ceremonies. Almost universally, the slaughter of a bull was central to the ceremony, usually as a
a tribute to and sign
lost my place there.
as a right here.
Where's your mouse? I was just
Right
tribute to and sign of obedience to the dominant goddess figure, the Great Mother. For instance, the flowers of the Great Mother cult, who were themselves drawn, first of all, from the ranks of the Roman slave class and from Oriental ranks of the Roman and from Oriental immigrants in Rome, involved themselves in a never-ending orgy of bloodletting. The rite of the Great Mother was a fertility cult ritual based on the myth associated with the story of the Great Mother, Sybil. The shepherd Attis, devoted lover of the sadistic Sybil, died, in the myth, by self-emasculation. In the cult's ritual, called the Taurobolium, performed at literally hundreds of temples across the Mediterranean world, a living bull would be placed on the cult's altar, and beneath it would be a pit covered by a grill. The high priest, before the rite began, would enter the pit below the bull, and when the bull was first castrated and then slaughtered, he would cover himself in its blood and bathe in it. Above, accompanied by drug-induced frenzy and wild rhythmic music, the followers of Sybil and her new initiates would dance and chant. As the cultists circled faster and faster around the bloody carcass to the sound of barbaric chants, the priests, drenched in blood, would emerge from the initiation ceremony. Each initiate would then seize upon the climactic moment to castrate himself as an act of devotion to the Great Mother. Usually, 2 sons were used for the self-castration ritual. Usually 2 stones were used for the self-castration ritual. As horrifying as such inhumane acts are to us, for the Roman oligarchy, they were simply what was needed to keep the masses drugged and content. The cults of Rome served the ruling elite as a mechanism of thought control. From the dawn of recorded history in the Near East, citizens of the tribal states were maintained in a perpetual state of animal-like backwardness by means of the cults, at the behest of a class of priests. Among themselves, the priests retained not only the existing body of actual scientific knowledge and engineering technology, used chiefly for the manufacture of miracles and staging of cult rites, but also the secrets of the mythology that was peddled so freely among the less fortunate. The Roman application of this policy was never stated more explicitly than by Polybius, the Stoic historian of the Roman Republic, in his histories. I will venture the assertion that what the rest of mankind derives is the foundation of Roman greatness, namely superstition. This element has been introduced into every aspect of their public and private life, with every artifice to awe the imagination, in a degree that could not be improved upon. Many possibly will be at a loss to understand this. My view is that it is done to impress the masses. If it were possible to have a state in which all citizens were philosophers, perhaps we might dispense with this sort of thing. but the masses in every state are unstable, full of lawless desires or irrational anger and violent passions. All that can be done then is to hold them in check by fears of the unseen and other shams of the same sort. It was not for nothing, but with deliberate. Am I still reading a quote here? Am I back to? I'm just
I
wondering.
feel like you're back.
I'm supposed to be back. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe not.
It was not for nothing, but with deliberate design that the men of old introduced to the masses notions about the gods and views on the afterlife.
Oh, that was still the quote. Right.
Oops. Polybius is shocking. Can we go? Sorry, can we go 2 seconds back? Read that last 2 sentences. So it's still the same quote. If it were possible to have a state in which all citizens were philosophers, perhaps we might dispense with this sort of thing. But the masses in every state are unstable, full of lawless desires or irrational anger and violent passions. All that can be done then is to hold them in check by fears of the unseen and other shams of the same sort. It was not for nothing, but with deliberate design, that the men of old introduced to the masses notions about the gods and views on the afterlife. Polybius' shocking admission of both his contempt for his fellow human beings and of his belief that only a federation of cults and superstitions can hold them in check brings us to the next level of our present investigation into the organized degeneracy that was Rome. For high above the bestial cults and murder rites that gradually seized the very soul of the state, there was the elite of Stoics and Aristotelians that controlled the very cults themselves, encouraged their proliferation, and engaged in a never-ending battle with the Neoplatonic movement that Philo and the Christians revived.
Now, the author is about to say something about Cicero, which in my research and Cynthia's research, I've come to realize is incorrect, as Cicero did not identify himself as a Stoic, and certainly not an Epicurean, but rather as a Platonist. But all that to say, this is the author here is putting forth a very strong hypothesis, not to treat every single element of what he's saying as the literal God's truth, but rather as a solid hypothesis with very good grounded reasoning justifying it. And I think it's important to just hold that in mind. But I had to put forth the disclaimer.
For instance, in 51 BC, another leading Stoic, Cicero, put forward an elaboration of the cult theory of Polybius. Cicero proclaimed that all of Roman life, public and private, must be governed by a network of cults and mystery religions. Cicero insisted especially that the priesthood must be kept in the hands of the aristocratic, and that the common man must always be made to seek advice and guidance from the priests. Uttered Cicero, the people's constant need of the advice and authority of the aristocracy holds the state together. In fact, it can be documented that the various cults and mystery religions were generally the direct creation of the Roman, and before them the Egyptian and Babylonian, alliance of feudal landowners and the priesthood, in opposition to the emerging class of seagoing merchants and industrial forces, what might be termed the early capitalists. Whereas the cults were not powerful as such within the topmost strata of the elite, who regarded them with some contempt, as is demonstrated by Polybius, the intelligentsia of the Roman world had been captivated by another cult, namely the cult of Aristotelianism. The cult of Aristotle took many forms, but what unified it during the Roman period was its commitment to the principle that sense perception was the unique source of both data and scientific and philosophical knowledge. For the followers of Aristotle, this cardinal principle of the empiricist epistemology meant that the grasping, selfish, infantile world outlook associated with reliance on sense alone must always be the ruling temper of mankind. Their belief was that man cannot rise above the need for immediate gratification of essential desires. For that reason, the Aristotelians of the Roman period, namely the Stoics and Epicureans, as well as the so-called peripatetics, fostered the growth of the cults in order to drive out of the heads of the masses any foolish notion that humanity is capable of perfection through its creative reason.
Okay. We could stop here, or we could keep going for another half hour or so and then chat. There's a lot that's been said as far as remarks of introduction. I don't think the philosophy is too complex. I mean, he's just sort of laying out a mapping. But maybe it's a good time for, at the very least, thoughts, or if people have a question based on what we've just read. Now would be a time, and then we'll just go on to the second section, I think, tonight.
I'll throw out a quick question.
Of course.
I'm meeting here tonight, right there, Philo Judaeus. Is he known by another name in more general history, or is he
Philo of Alexandria?
Yeah, I've never heard of this guy before.
Yeah, he's great. Well, I'm thinking as we're reading this, I've got one of his volumes of works here. I think we'll probably, as a follow-up reading to this essay, read a short essay by Philo, I think on the cosmos, which is sort of his Timaeus. He's a brilliant author.
Can you give me a 60-second bio about him?
Oh, he's going to go into it. His bio is going to come up in this paper.
Ah, beautiful.
Yeah. Rick? Oh, sorry, Quan first. Yeah.
No, I just want to say that he was famous for having created a school of medicine that would be called holistic nowadays, that it would heal the mind first and the body second.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
And they were called the therapeutic school.
Huh. Interesting.
Nice. Because here he was introduced as one of the founding fathers of Christianity, and I've never heard of him. Where have I been? Come on.
Well, it's interesting. His writings were preserved by Origen, who was himself the head of the Library of Alexandria, and saved his writings before the first onslaught burnt down a big chunk of the library. And Philo's thoughts on the Trinity, on the trifold nature of God, of God, were very important in the original debates of the Council of Nicaea that settled the idea of the trifold Christ, or the Christ, God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So yeah, what an irony, eh? A Platonic Jew created the conceptual framework for the Trinity.
Yeah. Well, if you look at his, he was born in 20 BCE, and he died in 50 CE, I think. Mm-hmm. So you can see that he was very close to the first generation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's going to be some evidence that will be brought up. I'm not going to say much more about it, of his association with Peter in Rome, doing battle with some of these cults. Rick, but we're going to read all about that in the next section.
All right, can you hear me?
For sure, yeah.
Oh, hi, Matt. This is Rick Hines.
Hey, Rick, nice to see you finally.
Nice to see you finally too. Nice to be. I just wanted to. I know this is a random thought, but I was almost wondering if the attack on Libya on Gaddafi in Libya is a ritual recreation of the destruction of Hannibal by Rome, because it kind of almost made me think of that. Weren't they in the same place? Wasn't Hannibal in Libya too? Or is it in Carthage in Libya? I mean,
Carthage is North Africa. I mean, most of all of North Africa, from Morocco to Egypt, or at least pressing on to Egypt, was Carthage. Yeah, I don't know his exact location. Quan, what would you say to that?
Carthage was exactly at the present-day capital of the small country called Tunisia.
Ah, right.
But you're right, Matt. Carthage was the other power of the Mediterranean Sea. So, except for Egypt, Carthage owned the part of Spain, part of Morocco, part of what is called Algeria nowadays, and part of what is called Libya nowadays. So, Carthage could have been the other Rome. but with a more powerful scientific background, as the paper said half an hour ago.
Yeah, and who knows if there's some element of ritual sacrifice that echoed what was done to Carthage the first time around when Libya was destroyed. Maybe on some level that was floating around.
Or maybe it's simply the same history repeating after 2,000 years. No need of symbolism here.
Or that. All right. I guess let's keep her going. Either Dave, if you want to keep reading, that's okay. Or if Bruce wants to read, that's okay too.
I mean, let's let someone else read. Make it a.
Okay.
Okie doke. Was that Dave Goslin by chance?
Yes, sir.
Haha, good to see you again or hear you again. Philo's Logos and the Kingdom of God. Philo Judaeus, the Jew of Alexandria, was a game master in the tradition of Plato and one of the greatest thinkers of all time. His influence on subsequent history cannot be overestimated. In a very real sense, Philo was the founder of the Neoplatonist movement itself and the architect of the humanist ecumenical religious principle that became the basis for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Almost
quickly, I'm so
single-handedly.
sorry. I'm just so sorry. I'm just going to say one little thought. At the time that this is being written in 1980, the LaRouche Association and their leading researchers didn't really make too much of a distinction in the positive and negative traditions of Neoplatonism, and everything tends to be labeled under one label, making it somewhat difficult to differentiate the fact that you had virulently evil Neoplatonic currents and really good, authentic Platonic currents. So just to have that in mind when they say that it doesn't mean that everybody who's a Neoplatonist is necessarily good. Just to.
Very good.
Yeah, and we could say the same thing for the Stoics as well, like Seneca.
True. Yeah, right.
And
Is this a LaRouche publication?
Yeah, Campaigner.
Oh, Campaigner. Okay.
1980.
Thank you.
Sure.
Almost single-handedly, against the great tide of Roman reaction and degradation, Philo constructed a system of Platonic epistemology, wielding it with the ruthlessness to change the course of human events. His voluminous work reverberated into every corner of intellectual life in the Mediterranean. Starved since the death of Plato and the disintegration of the great academy for advancement of the science of mind, and he resuscitated the heritage of Plato. Throughout his life, Philo was motivated by a single concern: to destroy the power of the evil cults and their priesthoods. On this, Philo was uncompromising. Whether among the Gentiles, whose frenzied mobs followed the oligarchy in performing the black rituals of death and self-castration, or among the Jews themselves, cultist and magical practices were the target of his unerring polemic. The weapon that Philo used in his battle against the cults was his concept of the logos, the principle of creative reason. The task of Philo was to create an elite. He had few allies. At the time of Philo's writing, early in the first Christian century, the Mediterranean world was profoundly paralyzed in its intellectual life. What brazenly called itself civilization had been seized by utter degeneration. Moral decay was everywhere apparent. In the sports arena, the slaughter of human beings and wild animals alike was an everyday occurrence. The insatiable demands of the Circus Maximus caused the extinction of the elephant in North Africa, and the hippopotamus in Sudan. On the stage, grotesques of the most unspeakable variety prevailed. In art, pornography, and pompous and banal monument building. In the realm of philosophy, Aristotle, the bitterest enemy of Philo, was king. Since the revival of the anti-scientific cult of Aristotle by Sulla and the Roman oligarchy 100 years before, the dissipation of the Platonic tradition by Plato's unworthy successors was complete. In the period after the master's death in the mid-4th century before Christ, the heirs of Plato's academy had failed to reproduce themselves, and instead, the perverse Stoic and Epicurean outlooks came to dominate the Roman mind. In addition, for generations, the cults and mystery religions of Isis and Osiris, of Magna Mater, of Mithra, of Apollo had gradually insinuated themselves into the Roman polity in open alliance with the peripatetic movement of Aristotle and the Stoics. It was into this bleak and barren landscape that Philo determined to introduce his logos. At first restricted to a narrow circle of collaborators in Alexandria, then spreading into the Jewish populations around the urban Mediterranean world, the logos of Philo finally established itself as the watchword for a state-building movement of elite Neoplatonists, the Christians. In this section, we will examine the process by which Philo generated a virtual renaissance among the Jews of the Roman world, forging a humanist faction among the Jews opposed to the Jerusalem temple establishment. Then we will look at the epistemological basis of Philo's movement, to which we owe our very existence. With the accession of Gaius Caligula to the throne of Rome in 37 AD, the always precarious position of the Hellenized Jews of Egypt was pushed to the extreme. The insane and sadistic Caligula, backed by an unholy alliance of the Roman military and oligarchy, and incited by the priests of Isis, threw down the gauntlet to the Jews of Egypt and Palestine. The emperor demanded that the Jews prove their allegiance to the empire. Of course, I was eating peanuts during the last part of David's reading. The emperor demanded that the Jews prove their allegiance to the empire by erecting his hideous statue in each of their synagogues. When this calculated challenge was refused, the mobs were turned loose. The Jewish quarters of Alexandria were burned and plundered, and homes ransacked by the rampaging crowds. Tens of thousands of Alexandrian Jews were herded from their homes, and their property was confiscated. Hundreds or even thousands of Jews were murdered. At the height of the crisis, the Jews of Alexandria chose a delegation to travel to Rome for the unpleasant task of attempting to reason with the madman Caligula. Named to lead the delegation was Philo, who recorded the mission in his embassy to Gaius. Pogroms against the Jews occurred periodically. Before this, raging mobs of animal worshippers and chanting cultists were the battering ram of the priesthood class that wielded effective power in the empire. On this occasion, the Emperor Caligula, who fancied himself a god, presumed to have himself represented as Apollo, in whose likeness statues were carved of the emperor. Thus, at the peak of his career, Philo traveled to Rome at the head of the embassy. He led the delegation in a humiliating quest for an audience with the demented king. For months, from his own description, Philo would trail the emperor from palace to palace, from appointment to appointment. Time after time, the emperor's party would simply ignore the Jews from Alexandria. Powerless and at the emperor's mercy, fearing that Caligula might order the wholesale execution of the Jews of Egypt, the delegation led by Philo spent a frustrating season in Rome waiting for some sign that Caligula would permit Philo to speak. Finally, with the wave of his hand, the emperor acceded to Philo's arguments. The Jews, quote, seem to be people unfortunate rather than wicked for not believing that I have been endowed with the nature of deity, grumbled Gaius. And the Jews won a shaky but viable toleration. In Alexandria, the mob was reined in. Because of such experiences, Philo developed a powerful and deep-seated hatred for the perpetrators of the backwardness and bestiality that plagued Egypt and the empire. Philo was well aware of the fact that it was Egypt in which the cult of Isis was based, and from which it spread its deadly venom throughout the empire. And he was brutal in his denunciation of the cults and mystery religions. With barbed wit, Philo declared that the Emperor Caligula, despite his pompous declaration of his own divine nature, had found no little trouble in winning any substantial following among his subjects for the idea that he was a god, except, Philo said, among the Egyptians, who were susceptible to it, quote, by reason of their belief in animal worship, close quote. Ouch. In a scathing commentary on the cult practices of the Romans and their Egyptian priesthood, Philo wrote, and the belittling of divine things is obvious to those who have keen perception, for they hold sacred a myriad of painted and sculptured forms. They erect temples for them and provide altars with images and statues. Such people, the sacred scripture aptly compares to children begotten of a harlot. For just as such children are registered as having for their fathers all the men who the mother has had as lovers, since no one knows the man who is their actual father, so the people who live in cities do not know the true existing God and deify an innumerable host of things falsely so called.
Ouch.
Philo's reference here to the harlot is a direct slap at the Isis mother figure, the whore of Babylon of St. John's Revelation, who was widely held as the model for the houses of prostitution maintained as temples and religious shrines. Denouncing the occult myths and mysteries as imposture and buffooneries, mummeries and mystic fables, Philo lashed out at the gross degeneracy of Roman Egypt. He accused the state of sponsoring perversion and homosexuality, citing the ranks of extravagantly dressed male prostitutes strutting about, heading the processions at the feasts. 2,000 years later, it is easy to overlook the fact that in speaking out and writing against such horrors, Philo was almost a lone voice. Such monstrous degradation was officially backed and encouraged by the political religious apparatus. The environment in which Philo grew politically was hardly one designed to facilitate the birth of a humanist movement. Perhaps the only organized force in the entire Mediterranean world that could be rallied to such a perspective as Philo's were the Jews. It was to them that Philo directed his polemic, and it was out of the Jews that Philo built his elite. Between 25 and 15 BC, Philo Judaeus was born into a family of Jewish merchants in Alexandria, perhaps the wealthiest family in all of Egypt. That was a rough and tumble city and a center of trade and commerce, out of which flowed the immense grain production of Egypt to fill the belly of Rome. Though founded by Alexander the Great, the city had become a cult capital under the influence of the evil Ptolemaic dynasty, which had seized Egypt immediately after the death of Alexander. Relying on magic and superstition, the Ptolemies built in Egypt a stronghold of mystery religions and animal worship. Philo's upper-class family were hardly humanists. Alexander Lysimachus, a brother of Philo, was known as the guardian of the mother of Emperor Tiberius, 14 to 37 AD. He is also reported to have made a substantial loan to Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great, who in 38 AD was designated as client king of Judea. His family was deeply involved in tax collecting for the empire, and some of them, for reasons of political expediency, renounced their Judaism. Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, records that Philo's nephew, Tiberius Alexander, who had been named procurator in Palestine in 46 AD, used Roman troops to kill an estimated 50,000 Jews during a rebellion. What little is known to us about Philo's life and education, it is known, while little is known about his life and education, it is known that he was thoroughly educated in Plato and the Greek classics, including Homer and the poets, and as a result was almost completely Hellenized. Not only did his education go far beyond the traditional Jewish curriculum to encompass the entire spectrum of Hellenic culture and philosophy, but his own writing indicates a superb command of Greek. According to most sources, Philo could not read Hebrew at all. His knowledge of the ancient Jewish law, including the Bible, was solely through the Septuagint Greek translation of the Old Testament. He is said to have read and reread all of Plato's dialogues, almost to the point where he knew them by heart. At this time, Philo's immediate friends and colleagues were drawn from among the ranks of the Jewish diaspora, Jews who had fled Judea in the preceding centuries because of political convulsions there and had been absorbed into the daily life of the Roman world's urban centers. Starting about 260 BC, the Alexandrian Jewish community began to develop under conditions of relative political and social freedom. In Rome, the Jewish colony dated from 138 BC, and 80 years later, the Stoic Cicero commented, quote, "You know how numerous they are and what commanding influence they exert, sometimes turbulently in the public assemblies. To offend the Jews is a matter of the gravest import," end quote. In Egypt, the power of the Jewish community can be understood by the fact that, according to Philo's own testimony, the population of the Jews in Egypt numbered over 1 million out of a total population of 7 million. To be sure, the Jewish population of the diaspora before the arrival of Philo could hardly be said to have represented a humanist movement. For the most part, the Jewish colonies were beholden to the temple establishment in Jerusalem, who were, with a few exceptions, collaborators of one or another faction of the cult that ruled Rome. Both Julius Caesar and Augustus favored the Jews, and a virtual partnership was established. In effect, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, Stoic cults that ruled the temple, were given a cut, mafia style, of the tax revenues of the Judean kingdom. In addition, by controlling the calendar of the Jewish year and setting the various feast days, the Sadducees and Pharisees collected a tithe of tribute from the Jewish colonies around the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, with proliferation of the fanatic Eastern cults of Isis, Apollo, Mithra, and so forth during the 1st century before Christ, the monotheistic Jews did retain a basic morality that made them unique. As the Jews of the Roman world gradually involved themselves in the daily life of the empire, becoming Hellenized, they became more and more distant from the establishment of the Jerusalem temple. For centuries, the temple cult had been a virtual puppet of first the Babylonian priesthood and then the Isis cult apparatus of Egypt and Rome. The Stoic Sadducees and Pharisees were losing their grip over the Jewish community. With each passing year, the diaspora Jews ignored their Hebrew and their orientation toward Jerusalem, and they adopted the ways of the Greek world. In this manner, they paved the way for the emergence,
Yes.
the emergence of Synagogue Judaism, which developed in Philo's time and accelerated, of course, after the 70 AD destruction of the temple. Synagogue Judaism continued until the 19th century, when the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry and British intelligence created the cult of Zionism, which sought to revive the old temple heritage and its cult. Wow. Despite the collaboration between elements of the Jewish leadership and the Roman state, the Jews never actually achieved full equality. The Romans desperately needed the skills and wealth of the Jews and often used them as administrators, merchants, traders, bankers, and so forth. But, as evidenced by the deployment of the mobs from time to time against the Jews of Alexandria, the Jews were constantly aware of their status as second-class citizens. In Egypt, because of their numbers, the Jews as a population represented a virtual state within a state, never trusted by Rome and the Egyptian government. At bottom, the Jew was The Jew had won only an uneasy toleration from Rome, and the Romans were constantly aware that the Jews of Egypt could emerge as an alternate center of power. The power of the Jews in Egypt is directly linked with Egypt's role as the granary of the empire. As a body, the 1 million Egyptian Jews were a force to be reckoned with, even by Rome. But on the other hand, the vast majority of Jews in Egypt were slaves of the same cults that ruled the empire. Recent archaeological discoveries have turned up relics of Jewish houses of worship in which cult symbols and statues took their place side by side with the Old Testament prophets, and chants and other rites of the cult of Isis would be incorporated into Jewish prayers and hymns. To placate the real power of the Jews, therefore, even an insane Emperor Caligula would, under pressure, make a concession or two to the Jews, such as occurred during Philo's visit to Rome. But for Philo, a merely powerful Jewish community was useless. A merely powerful Jewish community was useless for his purposes, unless it developed into an educated humanist elite. It is for this reason that the synagogue became a revolutionary institution as the first phase of the Christian transformation. Under Philo's careful guidance, those centers would become miniature academies for the transmission of science. According to the Jewish tradition, the rabbi was not a priest in the sense of a cult leader set apart from his followers. Instead, he was a teacher whose leadership derived from his acceptance by the people as a wise man who could impart knowledge. It was therefore to the Jews that Philo first sent his message of the kingdom of God. The emergence of Synagogue Judaism greatly accelerated the process of the creation of Philo's humanist elite. From outposts of the Jerusalem cult, paying obeisance to the cultish temple establishment, synagogues from Antioch and Asia Minor to Rome itself were transformed into lively centers of intellectual ferment in which Philo and then the apostles of Jesus Christ, led by St. Paul, would engage the congregation in Platonic dialogue. In other words, logos. This transformation could be called the Jewish Enlightenment. The Hellenized Jews of the Mediterranean were the raw material out of which Neoplatonic Christianity would emerge under Philo's leadership. It is this tendency that through the centuries has represented true Judaism. This is the ecumenical Judaism, not the narrow, almost tribal conception of the Jew who has internalized the ghetto mentality. The Jewish followers of Philo down through the years worked in close collaboration with humanist factions in both the Christian and Muslim elite and have consistently opposed the growth of a Zionist tendency. The method by which Philo forged a humanist elite of philosopher kings was as follows. The principle to which Philo dedicated his life was to establish on earth the rule of reason. The prevailing bestiality would have to be replaced with a new state, whose constitution would reflect the fact that logos, the principle of creative reason, was the organizing force behind the natural law that ruled the cosmos. Such a state, for Philo, one modeled on Plato's Republic, would be established according to what Philo called the Mosaic Constitution. In plain terms, Philo was plotting a revolution for a new world moral order. His first task was the creation of a leadership, generals who could instruct the soldiers and prepare them to battle for men's mind. Taking somber note of the fate of Socrates and realizing full well the evil nature of the Roman oligarchy and the Isis priesthood, Philo did not delude himself with visions of a direct assault. His movement would have to be created in stealth, and its soldiers trained in a secret language that could not betray them to the enemy. At the time of Philo, even to write an essay containing the real content of Platonism would probably mark the author for a horrible death, perhaps to be torn apart by wild beasts in the circuses. On this subject, Philo was blunt indeed. Quote, So then are those people not out of their wits completely mad? So then are those people not out of their wits completely mad who are rash enough to display inopportune frankness and dare at times to speak and act in defiance of kings and tyrants? So they are branded and beaten and mutilated and suffer before they die every savage and pitiless torture and are then led away to execution and killed. These are the rewards of untimely frankness, end quote. Instead, Philo created a secret language whose key to unlock its meaning was an allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament. A great deal of Philo's writing is allegory. For the initiate, his work constituted a secret language, secret knowledge. There is little doubt that Philo knew that the books of the Old Testament represented a political hoax perpetrated by the Persian manufacturers of religious myth in ancient times. However, realizing that the widespread knowledge of the Old Testament could be utilized in allegorical form, Philo undertook to provide an exegetical, wow, am I saying that right? Exegetical.
I don't know.
Well, he undertook to provide an exegetical commentary on the Pentateuch, and the prophets, and in the process, completely transformed their contents. The sayings of the Jewish scripture, the myriad laws and prescriptions, the legends of the Pentateuch and the prophets were used as a device for the presentation of Platonic epistemology. Philo's written interpretation of the meaning of key biblical passages, then, bore little relationship to the original intended meaning of the passage, but was a direct humanist exegesis.
I like the way you said exegesis. I'm gonna go with that.
Exegesis. I used to know that word, which communicated a completely new idea and pronunciation. For example, we cite here the opening passage of the allegorical interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3, or Genesis 2, 3, chapter 2, verse 3. And the heaven and the earth and all their world were completed. The commentary is, he had already told of the creation of mind and sense perception. He now sets forth fully the consummation of both. Using symbolic language, he calls the mind heaven, since heaven is the abode of natures discerned only by mind, but sense perception he calls earth, because sense perception possesses a composition more earthly and body-like. Cosmos, in the case of mind, means all incorporeal things discerned by mind alone. In the case of sense perception, it denotes things in bodily form and generally whatever sense perceives. The Neoplatonic content of Philo's interpretation of that passage of Genesis is quite obvious. In the course of the present paper, we will come across many other such examples of allegorical interpretation, but the most significant example is the case of Moses. Because Moses was known throughout the Jewish world as a lawgiver, Philo chose him as the figure to bear the message of the new law. Prefiguring the New Testament, Philo let Moses represent Plato for the initiate, and let the Mosaic Constitution and the Mosaic Law represent the republican content of Plato's Republic and Laws. For Philo's followers, this new Moses was at once father, teacher, and lawgiver. Philo showed that the Mosaic Law and natural law, or the law of reason, were identical, and he implicitly demanded that the hideous Roman state be brought into agreement with natural law. For instance, consider the following passage, quote, "While among other lawgivers some have nakedly and without embellishment drawn up a code of things held to be right among the people, and others, dressing up their ideas in much irrelevant and cumbersome matter, have befogged the masses and hidden the truth under their fictions." Moses, disdaining either course, the one as devoid of the philosopher's painstaking effort to explore his subject thoroughly, The other, as full of falsehood and imposture, introduced his laws with an admirable and most impressive exordium. He refrained, on the one hand, from stating abruptly what should be practiced or avoided, and on the other, in the face of the necessity of preparing the minds of those who were to live under the laws for their reception, he refrained from inventing myths himself or acquiescing in those composed by others. The world is in harmony with the law, and the law with the world. And that man who observes the law is constituted thereby a loyal citizen of the world, regulating his doings by the purpose and will of nature. End quote. The establishment of the figure of Moses/Plato by Philo opened the door to a revolutionary concept of political organization. At a stroke, the very definition of what it meant to be a Jew had changed. A new and universal conception of Judaism that superseded the old tribal racial notion had been born. For Philo, to be a Jew meant to subscribe to the Mosaic, i.e., that is the Platonic law. Until Philo, Jewishness was defined in rather primitive tribal and racial terms. To be a Jew was to originate from the tribe or tribes that, as far back as the Persian Babylonian era, worshipped the Jewish temple god Yahweh and obeyed the myriad laws and precepts of the Old Testament prophets. There were few instances of non-Jews converting to Judaism, which remained a closed family. Philo changed all that. He began by elaborating a universal content for Judaism. To Philo, unlike to the Sadducees and Pharisees who controlled the Jerusalem temple, it was not enough to be a Jew to guarantee holiness and salvation. Apostates, Jews who abandoned their religion, were denounced by Philo with the same venom as Jews who pretended outward piety but were hypocrites. Proselytes who converted to Judaism were eagerly welcomed by Philo, provided they accept the law, because, quote, they have thought fit to make the passage to piety, end quote. Philo even suggested that there exists a class of Gentiles who, having abandoned polytheism, subscribe to the law of nature even without formally becoming Jews. Their circumcision, said Philo, foreshadowing St. Paul, was spiritual, cutting off the pleasures of the senses and the passions. Suddenly, Judaism had been universalized. The task of the Jewish humanists was now clear. Philo was challenging them to assume responsibility for organizing the rest of the human race to the Neoplatonic perspective laid out in Philo's work. Intrinsically, he was challenging the perversion of Judaism into an ancient cult restricted to the land of Palestine and the tribes of Israel, maintained by the high evil priests chosen by Rome to suit the conditions of Roman rule. To this day, Philo is bitterly denounced by both Zionists and British historians who attempt to dismiss
It's right there.
him as a kook and a mystic. Most of them deny that Philo, in fact, can even be considered Jewish. The favorite portrayal of Philo by Oxford or Cambridge classical scholars is that of a lonely, eclectic rabbi who had virtually abandoned Judaism, perhaps even become Christian, who had fled from politics and the civic life into abstruse speculative philosophy and erudite commentary on the scriptures. Nothing could be further from the truth. Although he often stated his longing for the joys of the contemplative life, Philo emphatically was political. He wrote, "Truth would properly blame those who, without examination, abandon the transactions and business activity of civic life." And later, quote, "You have ridiculed civic life, politeia, perhaps because you have not realized how serviceable it is. You should first exercise and train yourself in the private and public affairs of life and become yourselves politicians," end quote.
Hold
In
that
the
thought.
P-
1 second. I'm just
Yeah.
curious if this section ends. Oh, it's going to go on for a while. Okay. All right. Let's close it up very soon.
You had best study these things and become yourselves politicians. In the purest sense, the followers of Philo, like the followers of Jesus Christ, had formed a political party. With them, Philo had created an entirely new concept of nationality. For the first time, the idea of a nation was based on the adherence of its citizens to a system of ideas. No longer was nationality based on territory or race or tribe, but on a brotherhood of common belief. The idea of humanism, as presented by the pre-Socratic Ionian philosophers, systematized by Plato and elaborated by Philo, forged the common bond for the citizens of the kingdom of God. As that notion took root in ever... There was I'm blocked by a comment here. Hold on one second. Yeah, as that notion took root in ever broader circles in the Mediterranean elite and in the population at large, a new nation, universal in scope, would be born within the decaying society of the Roman Empire, the seed crystal for an everlasting empire, founded on Rome's ruins, was in place.
That's a good spot. I think. Yeah. Let's end it there for today, and we'll pick it up at the same spot next Wednesday. Yeah. But I think that's a good cliffhanger. I noted that Declan made a point that sounds a lot like the Declaration of Independence. There's and who was it earlier? Rick also noted that Philo is starting to remind me of an awful lot of Ben Franklin. Yes, on both counts. Yes, there is a direct continuity there, though not a linear one.
So Philo's major work, what was the title of it? Or one of his major works you mentioned?
Well, the one I'm thinking about is on the Cosmos.
Okay.
Otherwise on Genesis.
Okay.
But there's quite a few really good ones. I've only read 3 or 4, but they're all great.
Where's he been all my life?
Waiting for you to find him.
Indeed.
Seeking you will find.
And Kevin, you just noted Philo reminds you in some way of John the Baptist, who was said to be sent before Christ to prepare the way for him. Good observation, Kevin. Not a bad thought. So yeah, if there's any, I mean, we're definitely packing in some high value big ideas here. And again, like I said, not everything you should treat as gospel truth, but this is a very strong, I find, concept set of hypotheses explaining and giving meaning to the occurrences, geopolitical, spiritual, epistemological, that shaped so much of our ancient history that then ties back into our present day pretty well. Yeah, Satomi, go for it. If your audio is not working, you got to write it out though. You're on mute, so. I can't actually hear you. Yeah, you're right. Your audio's not actually, or your mic's not working. Damn. Well, if you want to write it out, if it's quick, you could try it.
It's kind of a silly point because the broader epistemological teachings of and writings of Philo are just tremendous to listen to and to understand. But I was thinking, I thought I had confusion about Cicero, and I'm not particularly educated on this kind of thing, but I thought he was kind of this Senate in the Senate, and that he was quite known for his sort of, not necessarily, well, people considered him eloquent, but kind of BS-y kind of slum, and he was like a slumlord. And his
slumlord.
So I'm totally wrong on this, on Cicero.
I don't know about
different
his real estate holdings and how he was certainly a high-level political player, and he was an augur, which is one of the most powerful positions that one could be in as an advisor to the Senate. Quan could probably say a few words on this.
Sure. I'm just interested. I probably should look into it a lot more.
Yeah, let's not forget that Cicero was from a bourgeois background from the province. So when he came to Rome, he was a young man with a lot of ambitions that has been welcomed by the old aristocratic family of the Cornelius or Corneli, and they helped him to have his political career. So I think that when dealing with people like that, you have to understand their personal mind and their personal endeavor, and the political class members with which they associated with and having certain habits. So politics is a very complicated endeavor. It's very difficult to judge someone from certain details. You have to see the whole stuff. And in the whole stuff, he tried, I would say that the best argument in his defense, that he tried to advise the young Octavianus not to go in the direction of empire, and he was killed for that. So I would say that is probably the most powerful argument in favor of his true republicanism.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that he was complicit somewhat in covering up the murder of Caesar to some degree, wasn't he?
Oh, no.
Okay,
He
so I'm totally
tried
off this. I'm sorry.
He was part of the old Republican aristocracy. Well, he was a bourgeois. He was from a humbler background. He was from a bourgeois background from the province. But the Cornelius family was from the aristocratic background and was from the old Republican family. So in the Roman Civil War between, let's say, 50 BCE to 44 BCE, when Caesar was killed, he took the side of the own aristocratic family, but things were quite complicated. The fact that he was with those own aristocratic family doesn't mean that he was for empire, because when the young Octavianus wanted to create the empire, and the young Octavianus would be known later on as Caesar Augustus, he tried to pursue, to convince him not to go in that direction, but it was already too late, because the old aristocratic family of Rome between, let's say, 300 BCE and 44 BCE were too used to the looting of the weaker countries that they would not be capable to remove themselves from that drug of looting as a way of increase their wealth and power.
Mm-hmm.
Empire is a very difficult to treat disease once you get used to that.
That makes me think of a thought. Yeah, because I was reflecting at some point that, you know, like we could say that maybe Christianity was, in a sense, yeah, there was a correction or intervention, because Plato very much emphasized the education of the elites, which is important, right? And like a proper ruling class. And yeah, there's no doubt about that. And, you know, a fish rots from the head down, right? At the same time, though, what about people, right? What about regular folks who are not part of the aristocracy or whatnot? Are they supposed to just sort of sit there and wait for a savior, per se? So, you know, when I think of the interventions of Jesus on people, you know, there are so many, but, you know, from the salt of the earth to, unless you could kindle a certain moral impetus and love among the average citizen, the idea of just trying, there was no elite to organize. The elite was just totally corrupt, right? Like, for example, the Roman elite, like you're not going to organize a Renaissance by trying to organize vampire cults. These are just like full-blown vampire cults. You're not going to organize these people. They're satanic. So you had to do something different. And that for me speaks to what the Christian intervention was, right? Because it wasn't necessarily just trying to organize an elite class, but it was saying, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The meek shall inherit the earth. You could be of the most humble background, but if you truly desired and loved truth, beauty, and goodness, then there was no ceiling. And, even death, right? That was the other thing, that as long as people feared death, the enemy, right, this satanic force, could just use the threat of violence to silence people. And so at a certain point, you had to emphasize this higher transcendent idea, which even if you died, it was better than capitulating to these vampire cults. And so that's a very special kind of intervention that you need to have, and it was absolutely necessary. So that's something that more and more I appreciate. And that's a method, right? How do you just speak to regular people, right, and speak to that deeper image of God in each person? Because ironically, even a lot of people who are quote unquote educated, right, they have a lot of systems of knowledge and things that they've sort of been patterned with, but they may actually be harder to organize than the genuinely humble and meek person who has a genuine desire for goodness, truth, and beauty. So it seems like the Jesus approach there is definitely, there's something to ponder, goes without saying.
Mm-hmm.
Question. Quick question.
Sure.
How much of a percentage of the totality of the material to be read have we just covered?
I'm scrolling through it right now. 18%.
That's good.
That's confident.
And what do you think about this as a real major takeaway, at least for me, was toward the end there in the blurb, we basically was saying what Jefferson said: to expect a people to be free and ignorant is to expect what never was and never will be. You yourselves have to become good at private life and also public life. You have to become politicians. That to me is that seed kernel that blossomed with the American founding. And I'm excited to hear in the subsequent readings this underground thread of goodness nurtured by Christianity, when the public face of Christianity in many regards facilitated colonial and imperial conquest.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of like I guess what I was touching on when I felt like I needed to clarify, though it should be obvious, but for some it's not obvious, the nuance of just labeling Neoplatonism as one thing. Because a lot of evil was done in Plato's name too. And you read the writings of some of the worst elements of the oligarchy, and they think of themselves, they will call themselves Platonists, like John Ruskin in the pre-Raphaelite society. And you're like, how can such evil come out of people who think of themselves or label themselves Platonists, as well as so much good, the greatest bursts of goodness? And you're like, okay, it's not the same thing, right? It's the same thing for Christianity. A lot of how much evil has been done in the name of Christianity, crusades and burnings, and oh my God, right? But what is it? What's really the essence of the thing behind the surface appearance, the shell?
Well, kudos to all all the folks like Ben Franklin, between Philo and Ben Franklin, who passed along and got into the minds of the Franklins and his ilk around that time to get onto paper, in the very unique circumstance of the continent, the resources, and the size of the population, they could force and battle and get the American Republic up on its feet with its perpetual battles at its throat to this day.
Amen to that. Amen. Yes, Susie, I see your digital hand there. Where are you?
I'm not sure if my connection is good enough for you guys to hear me very well.
Yeah, sure.
I can hear you good.
But I'm just reminded once again of time after time, when good ideas gain widespread public attention, that oligarchy, a cult class of people, if they can't stomp them out, they infiltrate them.
Yep.
Everything we just read here is just amazing. And it really brings into view what Quan is always teaching about epistemological growth. And we are meant to grow as a human being. And when they talk about the faculties of the mind and reason, I hear everything that our mind is, not just the one facet of our brain. And I wish every single Christian I knew could read this and learn universal history, because so much of the Christian church has gotten so infiltrated and compartmentalized. You know, all my life there's been this saying, you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion. And that just keeps us so separated and compartmentalized so that we're not participating in shaping our world the way we're supposed to.
Yeah,
I'm
it makes
not
people
sure what else
really,
to say,
really
but this has
banal.
been amazing.
Yeah, thanks, Susie.
Sorry, say what you said again. We spoke over each other.
No, I just was gonna say it makes people really. It's a recipe for banality. Don't talk about politics or religion. It's like, what else are you gonna talk about?
Exactly.
You're completely ineffective.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rick, I see you got your hand there.
Yeah. I had to go away for dinner for the last part of the reading, but
Okay.
the first part about Philo of Alexandria, it reminds me a lot, like the Jews that are discussed in here, kind of remind me a lot of the Americans in the present day situation. You had Judaism, which defined itself as a movement going west for freedom to a frontier in the time of Abraham to get away from Ur and Babylon and all that. And then they established between Joshua and Judges, they had no king, but a republic. They had 10 Commandments, which was like the Bill of Rights, and they had judges to rule, and they were the only society that did that. And that often made me wonder why, if that's the real reason why the Jews were hated. In fact, is because, or if the origin of that came from the fact that they were the society that defined themselves as not having a king, like a proto-America. But then by the time of Philo, by the time of 0 AD, they've been demoralized enough and occupied and infiltrated enough to where they were susceptible to all these different types of cults. It reminds me of the Americans today being susceptible to all kinds of ideas like the Austrian school, or like being the best patriotic way, or China is in on the Great Reset. There's all these people that are dissident cult movements today, but they're being susceptible to following in false ideas like Falun Gong or like Scientology. So there's a lot of resonance between the Judea in the first century and America today.
Yeah. No, you got some good concepts there, Rick.
Yep.
Thank you.
Agreed.
And also just the geopolitical aspect as well. Not just the cult infiltration, but like, for instance, the Ptolemaic dynasty, or trying to prevent an alliance between Carthage and Rome, which I think you said.
Well, one of the things that made me draw the comparison between, and wonder about the comparison between ancient Israel and America, was back when the 9/11 Truth Movement was first starting out. I was listening to all these people like Alex Jones, David Icke, and all these Truth Movement, and there was all this talk about people carrying pocket constitutions. Remember that around 2008, 9, 2007, and that reminded me of the tassels, the garments that the Jews would wear to remind them of the law. That the law is sacred above all, and that if you have this law that's sacred and it's ironclad, it will protect you from the vagaries or the vicissitudes of all kinds of wild thinking, like cults and things like that.
Right.
That's a really cool thought, Rick.
Thank you.
No, I think that there's definitely that's key, right? Like you're in a world of seduction and confusion, designed confusion, all about, right, as part of the many minds that are placed in the epistemological minefield. So it's important to have a North Star to hold on to. And the Constitution provides anybody who's a serious thinker a really solid reference point, and the Declaration of Independence too, I would say, as you know, two sides of the same document, to always refer back to if you get lost with, you know, sophistry, trying to interpret or reinterpret, because how many interpretations do you have of the Constitution, right? How much evil has also been done to the Constitution, you know, of the greater good, a lot of evil, and it could get a lot worse. So to really have like a living sense of this deep universal history and the thoughts of the founding fathers who authored these things and the tradition that they were participating in in a self-conscious way is such an important thing for people to have. And what you're saying about the Jews as well, in a world where, you know, monotheism was not commonly believed to be true, right? Like that was the minority of the minority of the minority, and they were treated in a quite a hostile way. If everyone knows that we live in a multiverse with, you know, multiple gods and you know, all this stuff, and they will hurt you if you challenge that. So to have a set of traditions that you could tie yourself, or, you know, refer back to, the Mosaic works of the Bill of Rights. I like these notions and the various other traditions too. That, yeah, very good thoughts.
Thank you. Well, I was also thinking about the westward movement, migration too. You have this in Islam and into West Africa, and the most enlightened places seem to be further west. But it's not that people further to the west are better. It's just that the westward movement to get away from oligarchy, or to get away from entrenched hierarchy and landowning nobility, where things you cannot put your ideas into practice in a land that's ancient and stuck in its ways and entrenched. You have to go out west to found a new land to you know, put your ideas. And so the future of the Western migration will be going into space, like going up to Alpha Centauri or interstellar travel, that we'll be to get away from Earth's oligarchy. You know what I mean? Like, so hopefully if we can achieve that, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, Bruce, I saw your hand was waiting there for a while.
All conversations about natural law and the logos being a principle of creative reason, and creative reason that creates, implies, or I like to infer, something about the nature of reality along the lines of what is it that exists, and bringing in what quantum physics has discovered in the last 120 years, this seamless whole, this one thing that exists. I even heard tonight in the article about what the logos is, and references to divinity. And I'll just list a few things I'm reading and studying and just bumping into over the last few days, just constantly, and I love it. A nice lecture on the readings of Edgar Cayce, and he was well documented, thousands and thousands of readings where in his trance he made the takeaway of a study of his all of his psychic readings or channeled readings or whatever, is that consciousness is causal. Consciousness is the foundation of everything. And that's so consistent with how Plato and those who explicate him talk about the order of it and the harmony of everything. And even what Rick just said about space travel, there's a physicist named Nassim Haramein who for 20 years has become public, trying to resolve the last big problems that science and physics has had for the last 100 years. And he's lately announcing, new papers solving the gravity and the other whatever problem it is. I could come up with it if I had another minute, but people should look him up because he's on the brink of saying, I've solved the gravity problem to the extent that developing the hard technology for anti-gravity, which walks right into what's been theorized for 100 years of warp speed, warping time in order to facilitate even space travel. And this all comes out of, or is consistent with the theory that the only thing that exists is mind or consciousness. And it's all the wonderful things we attribute to natural law and harmonies and creativity. What exists is creatively expressing itself. That's all I got.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Hey, I just wanted to say one thing, and it ties together a lot of these points that were just made. And thank you guys. I'm learning a lot. I just want to say one thing that I think we don't want to miss is that Plato studied in Egypt, right? And these, modern day death cults, they label terrorist organizations as ISIS and things like that. And I'm just saying that, like, the space between Ptolemaic Egypt and ancient Egypt is like probably the space between us and Christ, or even more time period, right? So we've had oligarchs, and this stuff happened through society time and time and time again. But when you go way back, I think that one of the most ancient documented, what would I say? I guess documented idea of the logos is Ptah in ancient Egypt, right? He spoke the universe into being. He spoke the Ennead, and Isis was Aset paired with Ptah. No, I'm sorry, paired with Asar. And there was a balance, right? But maybe that's all I need to say. But like this idea, Plato studied in Egypt, and these ideas very similarly get corrupted, just like Christianity, right? Like the Christianity that we talked about tonight is very different from what we see in the Bible.
No, dude, absolutely. I know. And there's actually have you ever seen Femi Krasniqi's work on the Great Pyramid? That it's a wonderful 3-hour documentary.
No, I haven't. But let me just pay homage to the fact that some of these ideas from Egypt moved east, and we have these like unbelievable centers of knowledge, of ancient knowledge, like in places like Mali, and it's very similar. So these things are like echoes and ripples, where people who have the real knowledge have to leave the centers of oppression and try to keep it alive. And I'll leave it there.
No, absolutely. There's something definitely universal there, and certainly no culture which achieves greatness and endurance can be entirely bad. There must be something good that allows for the blossoming of a transgenerational culture that's capable of such accomplishments. And as you pointed out, Solon and Pythagoras and Plato, it's not a coincidence that they all spent a great amount of time in Egypt. And just like today, we can't treat any one nation as being all one thing. Like a lot of people want to label the United States as just like all 100% good and exceptional, or 100% evil, corrupt, and a mistake. And it's like, no, there are factions representing different worldviews that have been at odds with each other, and at different times you see different representatives of either faction coming into a position of power and doing things that are either really good or really bad, and out of whack with natural law or in harmony with natural law. And treating Egypt as one thing would be wrong as well. There's been times of decay and times of growth and times of good and times of evil. And sure enough, yeah, that's a very important lesson.
And I think it's important to look at each of the religions that way as well, because there are pieces of truth And there are areas of corruption in each of the religions as well.
Except Satanism.
Very
Good
true.
point.
Very true.
But is that a religion?
That's a good question. Yeah, right there. Yeah, right. Depends how we define religion. Then what you just said might be a game changer. Right. Depends what your standards are. Well, I think definitely Akhenaten is somebody who I've been very fascinated by, and the monotheistic revolution that Akhenaten brought in a short time. What is it like? He was like a few hundred years, 100 or 200 years before Moses. And I mean, to overthrow all of the polytheistic deities and establish a unifying oneness, that's cool that he did. I'd love to know more. And I know there's some videos that I've seen. If anyone's looked into this more, speak out. But I know I've seen a few videos and I've read a little book a while back which had a lot of images of the arts and the revolution of naturalistic arts that occurred during the time of his reign, that were all undone when his son, I guess it was Tutankhamun, came into play and undid his father's works. But the arts became hyper naturalistic, very honest portrayals of biology, of things like that, which are not there before or after him. So interesting phenomenon, and an anomaly that many have been trying to obscure, just wipe off the map. I think he was forgotten about until like maybe a century ago. So that's definitely going to be a key for a lot of discoveries in world history in the future. And definitely, like I was saying, Femi Krasniqi, his work on the Great Pyramid, Kwan introduced me to Femi's research in his documentary, which is just got some really mind-blowing prospects to it. And I've done 3 interviews with him so far, and each one is quite good.
It's what I love about architecture. Yeah, I mean, you could look at Chartres Cathedral, and there's no way to say that these people didn't know something, right? Yeah. And I mean, then you go to the Great Pyramid, and it's like that times 10.
Yeah, right. Or it's like, too, like all of the effort that's been put. Cynthia is doing. She's writing part 4 of her series. It's going to be a book on Freemasons, Jesuits, and anthropologists, and how specifically the ghost dance religion was created. And she's going to go through just also the manipulation going back to the 16th century in North America and South America as well, of just how the Native Americans, whatever you want to call that, the First Nations peoples were heavily manipulated and by these, especially Jesuits, but it branched out, and there's an overlap to the point that there's been this movement to convince all of these people that they're naturally hunter-gatherer, anti-technology. You know, the Mayans didn't use wheels; they didn't discover the wheel, and like the idea of having like a complex civilization is so against their their essential spiritual way of being, which is just one with the land. And it's like it was never true. You look at the incredible civilizations of the 13th century in Virginia and Carolina, and there's these incredible artifacts indicating something highly complex, or the Incas or the Olmecs, and there's so many more in Guatemala and Machu Picchu that just showcase such a high level of civilizational development, which is the true heritage of the people of the Americas before Columbus, and not the repackaged garbage that they've been given by Margaret Meads and anthropologists who've been trying to convince them that they're naturally anti-technology.
Well, one civilization maybe people look into is the Garamantes in Libya. They were around the same time as Rome, and they were really into going down deep into the groundwater and collecting the groundwater from below. And they actually contributed to the Roman knowledge of aqueducts and everything. And they were a black civilization. They were Tuareg people from Mali and all those areas, and they were experts in. They were almost like the Nabatea, in the Nabateans, who also were experts at plumbing. So I think that when you have a desert condition and you can extract water, you can overcome the limits to growth. Civilization arises from not being able to live on hunting and gathering anymore. So, that's your limit to growth. If your rainfall stops, so you would tap into your groundwater and build reservoirs and things like that. So this idea of humans just being naturally, at the mercy of nature, I mean, that's a good point you make, Matt. I really like that. I mean, it's a lot like my thinking on that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
This goes back to in the article they talked about the cult all revolving around the worship of, well, the bulls specifically, but they were all doing animal worship. And if we circle back to Quan's representation of the hexagram, sometime Quan will call it the lower trigram, he will call it the animal kingdom, right? And so when we talk about, well, the Roman people or today's Native American, it's all a scheme to keep them in this animal worship, meaning this animal layer of the epistemological development. It's a dumbing down, really, to put it simply.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
If they can keep us functioning in the animal layer and heavily in superstition, then our minds are not growing and expanding. We're not overcoming the limits to growth, and we're not challenging their place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the one thing that was also mentioned that caught my eye in the article was that those cults, even though they were, animal worshippers, they still dabbled in the unseen, right? So when we talk about Plato, he still, Plato and the cults will both talk about the unseen, but they get at it from different perspective, right? So the cult take at it from the animal perspective, whereas Plato will look at it from, ultimately the philosophical king. So there's a lot of similarities, but it's a lot of corruption on their part in the end.
Yeah, or maybe an orientation more to the earth than to heaven, because once again, I quote from the article, all the mother goddesses, either Rhea, Cybele, etc., they are the domineering mother earth that would give you a pantheon of gods, but not from the higher kingdom, but from the animal kingdom precisely. Because what's his empire after all? Empire is the most powerful achievement of the animal kingdom. And I would like to remind that George Orwell wrote a book called Animal Farm.
Nice observation, right?
Okay, and Animal Farm is an allegory of empire, of the animal kingdom, precisely.
Very good point.
But also,
Very
I keep
interesting.
thinking about, Matt, you bringing up, in the time of Lincoln, he was having difficulty getting people on board with him because they would rather sit and wait for Jesus to come back and get them. And there's an awful lot of people that are stuck in that same place today. Instead of really engaging in the transformation of our culture, they're just expecting any minute that Jesus will swoop in and rescue us.
There's a lot of variations on the same theme. Yeah. Pretty much any the way I see it is any spiritual doctrine that renders you impotent from action, taking moral action in the face of evil, is probably wrong. There's probably something wrong with it. So yeah. Or that has you become an instrument of said evil for the sake of fulfilling some interpretation of some prophetic scripture, whether from the Sikh, there's all sorts of post-millennial variations on the theme in the Jewish and the Sikh and the Hindu texts as well that are perverse readings of something ambiguous said by a prophet or a sage that then can turn people into geopolitical instruments used by forces they don't understand. What, like the Khalistani movement in right now has been a perfect example of that sort of synthetic creation of British imperialists and their little stooges in India, who created a movement just like what was done with some of these Masada cultists, who want to rebuild the third temple in another part of the world. But it's all sort of variations of the same theme.
Absolutely, because in the animal kingdom, precisely, not everyone would be dumb enough to accept the lower form of mind control. Okay, like the bull sacrifice and that kind of stuff. You need to be, I'm sorry to be so direct, you need to be really to be dumb to be attracted to that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's really the first line. Okay, sense perceptions. Let's not forget that in the animal kingdom, you also have the second line, which is intellect, and the third line, which is psyche. So for the people having developed their intellect and their psyche, you need to create bigger narratives that would into which they would invest their energy and their intellect, so they would not go to the upper trigram, precisely because those mega narrative would take their energy, which is at the higher level, at the intellect or the psyche.
Right.
I have a sneaking suspicion, no actual facts or anything like that, but if you were to build something the size of the Great Pyramid, it seems to me that you're trying to speak to the future and say, hey, guess what? Like, we weren't like all barbarians back in the day. Look at what we could do at this point in time. And yeah, I mean, it's almost a reminder, like, unless you're going to get rid of the pyramid, it's almost a monument to human intellect, and not just intellect as an academic thing, but it's a sacred science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the fundamental thing is this we live in a world where there are opposites, and animals don't really question the opposites that exist, dark and light and finite, infinite, our mortality, immortality, right? They're the curved and the straight, like there's all sorts of examples of things that are opposites, and animals are just kind of okay with that, and they'll just let it be and go with the flow. They got consciousness, but they don't necessarily have the power to be perplexed by a paradox and think it through or resolve something, right? So there's a limitation there. They're good for what they are. Whereas human beings, we can deal with these things, but how we resolve these apparent opposites will differentiate, I guess, what tradition we find ourselves situating ourselves within, because the oligarchy will have their own. There's a consistent formula for resolving opposites from the oligarchical matrix. They will play with opposites left, right, for divide and conquer purposes, emotions, reason. Like they'll use them as a formula to get people to fight each other, so that they're too busy actually working together to defend themselves the way they could if they were smart. But the oligarchy for the inner elites have their own way of resolving the opposites, just like the Christian humanist Platonists also resolve those opposites. But the way that they resolve them is from two different universes. One ultimately resolves them from the standpoint of everything is resolved in its common communion with irrationality, with ugliness, with something that is ultimately like everything is equally absurd. Whereas in the standpoint of a Philo or a Plato or a St. Augustine, they'll resolve it from the standpoint that everything is united ultimately in creative goodness, love, truth, justice. Like there's these principles that are ultimately good. And, and I think that the pyramid expression is something that does try to resolve the finiteness of our immortal lives with the infiniteness that we're participating in the universe and with the species. It's a solid testament to that.
If we're getting ready to close up, we have to end on a note of hope. And I love it that he started out that article quoting from the book of John. And he said, in the beginning was the Word. And he defined logos as creative reason. So if nothing was created except by creative reason, then we were created from creative reason. And that will prevail. Beauty, goodness, and truth are our pursuit.
Yep.
Amen.
Beautifully said.
I was thinking the same thought. Thank you.
Cool.
Satomi, I know you just said one of my teachers said that the Giza pyramid was built by light and sound. What do you think? I would say watch the documentary this week. If you take a little bit of time one evening, sit back with popcorn, watch the documentary, and let me know what you think.
Have you heard that the pyramid may have been also using types of resins in mass?
I've watched hundreds of documentaries and videos and other things. I've been obsessed with this for many, many years. And I can honestly say that I've never found anything that satisfied reason as sufficiently. I'm not saying this is perfect, but as sufficiently and satisfactorily as this documentary that I just shared, that Kwan discovered and shared with me, that I just shared in the chat box. So take 2-3 hours, watch it. It is professional and satisfying, and it doesn't necessarily leap into the need to go to intergalactic beings or aliens or Atlantean civilizations or Hyperborean. It doesn't need to do that. It actually finds something that I could follow every step of the way with my reason, that I could also find persuasive at the same time without relying on slave labor, nothing of the sort.
Right.
And for people watching this on the playback who don't see what's in the chat box, the title is The Great Pyramid Documentary, with a symbol, and then the creator's name, Femi Kresniki, on the channel Merlia Spirit. It's on the YouTube channel Merlia Spirit, MERLIA, uploaded about a year ago. So those are the words people can search on YouTube and find it.
Okay. Actually, the easiest way to find it is just type Pyramid K 2019, and you will find it.
Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah, that'll do it. Thank you, guys. And I'm actually going to share, just for good measure, an interview that I did with the director as well, which I just shared. That's going to be harder for people to find, but type in Femi Kresniki, my name, Matthew Arrett, and you might find that one of those interviews too. But watch the documentary first. Don't watch my interview first. Watch the documentary.
All right, but your interview's on your own channel there, the Rising Tide Foundation.
See.
Question. How do you resolve the problem with? Can I ask?
No. Go ahead.
I'm struggling with Christianity because I was a former Christian, for many years, and I am struggling with the idea that it's a sin to engage in politics and philosophy, to do anything short of just waiting for Jesus to return, like the rapture and the end time, the post-millennial. The idea that if you put your hand to the plow and look back, you're not fit for service in the kingdom of God. And Paul said, just as a soldier likes to please his commanding officer, he does not get involved in civilian affairs. I was told this in my church when I brought up politics. So I was kind of imbued with indoctrinated with the idea that in fundamentalist Christianity, that it's a sin to get involved in politics or talk about politics.
I'd like to get Declan's thoughts on this. I would just be curious, how would these people have resolved the existence of so many really good, solid Christian politicians and presidents? How would they possibly think of that? But Declan, what do you think of that question?
Yeah, I do not agree with that at all. I think that G.K. Chesterton said that the only two things worth talking about are politics and religion, and that I think it's integral in being a Christian to understand what's going on in the world and being in the world but not of the world and stuff like that. Those are all things that that are integral to being a Christian. And so I in no way think that that politics and Christianity are against each other, as Matt Ehret said. Actually, what Chesterton also said was that the only wars worth fighting for were the religious wars, because those are the only ones that mattered, which is an interesting thought when you think about it. Because something as like religion is so important that it's the only thing worth thinking about when it comes down to it is who God is and what am I supposed to do about that fact. But yeah, those are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
That's super dope. And back to my original thought is, you know, I think when we think of Egypt, we think of the King Tut death mask, right? But the Bible is more ancient to us. No, I'm sorry. The pyramids were more ancient to King Tut than the Bible is to us. And this idea of, you know, this linear progression of humanity and intelligence seems to be a farce. You have to go way, 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 way back, like maybe tens of thousands of years before you can find humans that are like, you could say like, yo, there's no way you're as smart as I am. Right. But we have a pyramid in the desert, right, that we can't build today. So that seems like a testament. And yeah, so I would almost look at not just Egypt, or, you know, you could go all around the globe, but these ideas, the seeds of these ideas, you know, you call them proto-Christianity or whatever you want to call them. But I think that we were struggling with trying to find our space in the cosmos. And this is not anything new. I think we got off track and got back on track, you know, at various points in history. And that's a struggle that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, like to your point, we don't really know how far back those things are. We can pretty much estimate. We know for a fact that Jesus was around 2023 years ago, but before that, it's kind of hard because dating the Babylonians, I think, were the ones that figured in that kind of instituted the calendar, as we know today, started that whole tradition of calendars and dates and stuff like that. And I look at timelines, and every single timeline is a different date for everything once you get back a couple thousand years. And so, yeah, I think that there was a lot of smart people along my back.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, where they weren't dumb.
And if possible, I'd like to speak to the question that Rick asked. I'm not sure I can place it exactly when the church began to retreat from the public square so much, but Jesus said that we are the salt of the earth. Salt is a preservative, especially at that time. If we are not engaging in our culture, how are we being a preserving influence? I think we can see quite clearly we have not been for quite a while. So we need to get properly re-engaged in all facets of our society and all be seeking truth together.
Yeah, well said.
Rick, inside your question, I think I heard you allude to, well, you definitely said you implied or you said you're not Christian anymore, but you could, and this is one thing, one aspect that was always that kind of hooked you, like, but would by now you maybe I'll just reflect, there's so many different factions of Christianity and so many different schools of thought of Christianity based on these 2 or 3 verses put together give you that conclusion, but these 2 or 3 verses to put together give you that conclusion. So Rick, what do you think about that? Sorry, I jumped in front of you, Kevin, with your hand up.
Oh, well, can I answer?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I say I'm not a Christian according to like the really strict fundamentalist, where only 1% of the people are going to be saved and 99 are going to go to hell. Like the real hardcore, like you got to, the letter of the law word, like that kind of Jesus is the only way to salvation. You've got to say that Muslims are going to go to hell, Jews are going to go to hell. Like that kind of Christian, I'm not anymore. But in a more lukewarm or more, philosophical, I am a Christian. Totally.
I'm glad I asked then. Thanks. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, for my part, I just wanted to chime in on your question, Rick, because I come from, the opposite background where I come from an atheistic family, if you want, but I'm getting into Christianity by my own. And one of the things that I stumble on, if you want, is that the Jewish community, when before Jesus came on the scene, were expecting a kind of warrior prophet, right? They were expecting someone who would bring down the Roman Empire by force and violence and by the sword, basically. But when Jesus came, he basically said, no, that's not what I'm about. I'm here for the battle of ideas. And what is the battle of ideas other than politics, right?
Mm.
Oh, good
So
point.
to my mind, Jesus was he was the quintessential philosopher king, right? He was acting in politics because
Absolutely.
he was acting in the world of ideas. So to me, from my background, which is completely contrary to yours, it seems funny to say that as a Christian, you should not get into politics, because that is exactly what Jesus did. And that is exactly what he asked of his apostles to do and his followers, right? So I find that funny. That's all I'm saying.
And Kevin, also that ties into just the zealot community kind of ties, and I don't mean to denigrate Native Americans, because I have a lot of respect for First Americans and everything, but just the ghost dance maybe could be related to, where they wanted the whole destruction of of all the white people by doing the ghost dance and retribution on Earth, like that kind of a deal. It kind of ties into the zealotry a little bit of manipulation of religions and politics in a negative way.
And it also overlays perfectly with what was mentioned earlier about Quan talking about the animal level versus, I'm not exactly sure what the next level of that after that is, but to think of the Jews simply looking for the warrior king that was going to come and free them from the Romans is staying on that more animalistic layer of our development instead of really rising up in the epistemological growth. And we keep repeating the same pattern. So I pray we will grow through it to the next stage now.
Yes.
Just to clarify that, the whole view of what I was talking about, it comes from the evangelical, the only thing you got to do is just make disciples, and don't try to, if you try to, and just put your hand to the plow and go out there and try to bring people to church, and don't worry about politics, and that's all a distraction. That's the view. So, and that's prevalent in America today, and it's very popular.
Yeah, well, it has a certain virulent nature, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even that verse about putting your hand to the plow. The plowing we are doing right here. We are breaking up the fallow ground in our hearts and minds every time we meet in one of these discussions.
You get a poetic spirit, and I guess that's that's the thing that human beings really, that gives us the edge, is that we're the species that generates metaphor, that generates poetry, and you can always find a universal, like, because how are you ever going to describe something through, if we only have our lives as reference points, right, to measure our experiences against, and the thoughts we encounter, well, we've only experienced things that our ears or our eyes could pick up, or that our senses could interpret. So how do you get an idea of a universal that you'll never sensually experience? Like justice, like something that involves these higher agapic love of humanity, like humanity. You'll never experience all of humanity that's ever been, is, and always will be. Like, these are totally abstract ideas. So if you don't have a poetic sensibility, which is also playful, that doesn't take itself too seriously, and is humble enough to be aware that we don't know everything, the way Socrates said, I know that I don't know, which gives me an edge over those who I'm in debate with, who think they know things that they don't know. So in that sense, I'm in a better place. So very, very, very high quality humility mixed with an allegorical spirit. So that's something which gives us direct communion with God. And I was just reading just quickly this paper by Edgar Allan Poe on Eureka, one of the last things he wrote, on his thoughts on the spiritual and material universe. And he's essentially going in through a praise of Kepler. He's doing a polemic against both Aristotle and Francis Bacon as two different false paths that the mind could take to get to knowledge, without ever getting to knowledge, but only feeling like it has knowledge. One he calls creeping, the other crawling. But then he goes through Kepler, and how Kepler had a creative quality of leaping outside of the realm of creeping and crawling, deductive and inductive logic. And towards the end, he says, like, this proves that we are made in the image of the creator, because the creator is a poet. So he doesn't treat the creator as like the creator God as if he's like just a literal tyrant demanding obedience, and that's it. But that the creator is in an ongoing process of creation, of creating. It's more of a verb. It's a beautiful thing. And that we can only be in the living image if we are ourselves also tapping into that same spirit. Makes you think about Shakespeare in a different light. Declan wrote, when I consider the hand to the plow verse, I think of more not questioning God's plan rather than the plans of men, which, as Burns said, the best laid plans of mice and men, gang after glay. What? Declan, expand.
Well, okay, so what I was thinking of was that verse about the hand to the plow, and the context I understood it in was that you put your hand to the plow and do not question the God's plan. Sometimes he might send you trials and travails. Bad things happen to us all the time. That's like the stereotypical Christian movie is always like, my friend dies of cancer, and so therefore I must be an atheist. Politics rather concerns the plans of men and the workings between men and how they govern each other, which is very much very much something that you obviously should be involved in, because you're being governed, and you have a consent to being governed and stuff like that. And so that's, I think, how I would interpret the verse. I'm not sure how it was interpreted in your context, Rick.
Oh, well, yeah. It was more of counting the cost. That you have to give up everything and become I was in a cult, in a religious cult, and we were told we were the only ones going to heaven. So, and I was in there from 1991 to 1997. and it was all about, you know, baptizing people and bringing them into the church and teaching them, taking them through this initiation so that they would become saved, and that's what you had to do to be saved, and it was all by God's election, and there's nothing you could do. It's not by your works, and so it was a very narrow. It's just my experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because, like, so in a Catholic funeral, traditional Catholic funeral, so after you died, the priests dress in black, and everything's all the vestments are black and everything, because and our priest explained it to us, is that you don't know, only you know the deepest things that go on in your heart, the deepest things you think and stuff like that, and you can never know if somebody else is saved because you don't know them completely. Only God knows you absolutely, and yourself. And so in a funeral, the point of the funeral is not to celebrate life. That's why a celebration of life is kind of a little bit weird for a funeral. You're really praying them into heaven, because that's when they need you most, is when they've ended their life and they're going to be judged, and they need those prayers then. And so that's the thinking between you can't know if anybody's saved, really, but you can do your best, and that is usually good enough. and that's what makes that's the Catholic way of thinking of it, is that there's no there's not certain people that are stamped being saved and some people who are not going to be saved. And so Hitler, on his deathbed, might have said in his last moments he believed, and that he was sorry for everything he did, and he was saved in that moment. But we don't know that. So we still pray for Hitler. Maybe he had that moment of conversion. Maybe he didn't.
During that hot night in Argentina in the 70s.
Exactly. Exactly. So those are my thoughts.
I'll just add, there's the so I've been thinking about this as well. You know, one of the main fundamentalist things which ties into this as well is we're saved by grace alone. So your works are rags, right? The slave on the cross next to Christ, you know, it's not because they did anything or whatnot that they're saved. So that's often used. But again, like it's always context, as we're saying, you know, in different places. Unless we know the context for the stories and on the letters, the epistles, like Paul is speaking to different people, right? Ephesians, Corinthians, and he's addressing different things in these different parts. So unless we know that, just keying off the literal words can be misleading. So like, you know, it says when I was a child, I loved childish things. When I became a man, I put away childish things. But Christ himself says, truly I tell you, if you're to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must become like children. So should we become men or should we become children? You know, is the Bible just like contradictory like that? Or, as our friend Quan always likes to talk about, it's a question of epistemological level, right? At what level are you thinking about that? There's no contradiction on a higher epistemological level between becoming more like children and becoming a man. And that's also where poetry comes in. And so because I hear this a lot, we're saved by grace alone, or your works are rags. But you know, in the story of Cain and Abel, Cain's offering is rejected while Abel's is happily accepted, because God accepts your best, right? He wants your best. And so because Abel gave his best offering, God was happy, whereas Cain just gave whatever. For him, it wasn't a big deal, but it didn't mean anything because it wasn't actually his best. And so what God actually expects is people to offer their best. And so that's what they should, you know, only we can know. Are we truly giving our best? Or are we just kind of miming and mouthing the right thing?
Can I offer a suggestion? You know, I've been thinking of late. What if it's more? the salvation issue is more of a national salvation type thing, rather than maybe we're so programmed by the capitalistic of the individual salvation. I've got to get mine. I've got to get my salvation, and then forget everybody else. It's kind of like, and then you got to go out there and pound the pavement trying to get people into your church. Kind of like making the sale, right? It's very sales based, and maybe that's a totally wrong way of looking at it. Maybe Jesus was, because in scriptures they would say preach against Nineveh in the Old Testament, and that was a nation. So it was more like the nation was going wrong rather than the individual. So maybe your salvation is the nation being saved from destruction by accepting a higher morality. Maybe it's more Platonic in that way. So I'm more of that view now. I'm just thinking.
Well, there's no contradiction if we're thinking about it on the right epistemological level.
Mhm. I think these are very good spiritual thoughts to chew on and share. I love these little philosophical Wednesday nights. This is good. So next Wednesday we'll meet up again. I got one question. Who would be interested, in case we have some newbies showing up, doing a brief recap? And this doesn't mean there's no grading system. There's no, and you don't have to get everything. It's not a full recap, but the general gist. Who would like to try to communicate the general gist for those who just show up next week? I'll tell people they should watch it. I'll put that in the message. You should watch it first, but otherwise,
yeah.
You could tap me if I want. I'm gonna be here, and I'm gonna read. Like, this is very new to me. I just signed up today, so
cool.
I'm a newbie. I'm a newbie, but I'm loving it all. And I just want to say thanks to everybody who's spoken tonight. I mean, I've gotten some food for thought, and it's beautiful to me.
And me too.
Likewise. Cool, guys.
Beautiful
All right, so
fruit, Matthew. Beautiful fruit.
Very. Yep. All right. And so for those who don't know, also this Sunday, Marty Seif is going to do something on the Anglo-French destruction of Mexico. Being Marty is an entertaining speaker, and definitely there's going to be some insight bombs there. So it's Sunday at 2 p.m. and then otherwise we'll meet back next Wednesday. So thank you, everybody.
And
Great.
Matthew. I'll do a recap.
You'll do a recap.
I'll have to study the thing and try to do my best. And if I can't do it, I'll let you know at the time. But otherwise,
I'm sure other folks will just jump in to
okay, good. I'll try it.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
See you guys.